Ibrahim Traore was not expecting Egypt to come. Not after years of silence. Not after decades of watching North Africa negotiate behind closed doors while the Sahel burned. But something shifted. On a quiet morning, a plane landed, unmarked, discreet, but heavy with history. From its ramp descended not just a diplomat, but a signal. What happened next did not make headlines in Paris or Washington. But in Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, it was thunder. Egypt, with all its weight, had chosen to stand with AES. And this was not charity. It was strategy. Brotherhood. A reckoning. Because make no mistake, the Sahel no longer asks for protection. It builds its own shield. And now, Egypt, the guardian of the Nile and the gate of the Arab world, was handing over tools, not commands. This story is not about a meeting. It's about the birth of a new African order. If you believe Africa deserves to protect itself on its own terms, like, comment, and subscribe. Because the world isn't ready for what's coming next. According to sources from Patriote du Sahel, Egypt's support for AES is multidimensional. Militarily, it shares Sinai-hardened counterterrorism training, intelligence tools, and possible logistical equipment. Culturally, Al-Azhar trains African imams in moderate Islam to counter jihadist ideology. Economically, Egypt hosts forums with AES countries on mining, agriculture, and infrastructure. Diplomatically, Cairo respects AES sovereignty, unlike ECOWAS or the EU. But behind this alliance lies a question: why now? What pushed Egypt to pivot from North African isolation to Sahelian partnership? Let us begin where others stop looking, inside the strategy room of Cairo. In geopolitics, there are no favors, only transactions. For decades, Egypt saw itself as a bridge between worlds. The Arab League, the African Union, the Suez Canal, it was the cultural crossroad, the diplomatic heavyweight, the power in the north. But while Egypt played chess with Europe and the Gulf, something else was burning below the board: the Sahel. Mali was bleeding. Burkina Faso was under siege. Niger was shifting. And while France and the West scrambled to hold onto influence, the AES was born, in fire, defiance, and absolute clarity. No foreign tutelage. No compromise. No more begging. This terrified many. But not Egypt. Because Cairo knows something others forget: when the fire is in your neighbor's house, you build a wall, or you burn next. That is the real reason Egypt turned south. Not out of guilt. Out of foresight. Let's be clear. Egypt did not just send weapons or prayers. It sent a message: we stand with those who choose sovereignty over sponsorship. Traore's AES represents something Egypt once embodied: self-made security. During the war in Sinai, Egypt fought not just men with guns, but ideologies wrapped in scripture. It built methods to detect, dismantle, and disarm extremism, not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of young men. That knowledge is now on loan to the AES. Training officers in demoning. Teaching urban combat tactics. Sharing signals intelligence. This is not symbolic. This is replication of Egypt's hard-earned doctrine against jihadism. Now written into the Sahel's veins. But war is not just fought with rifles. It is fought with words. With beliefs. That is why Al-Azhar, Cairo's intellectual crown, has begun training imams from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. These aren't clerics for Cairo. They are shields against radicalization, preachers who speak the language of peace in a land taught to worship fire. Imagine a village boy in Mopti hearing Friday prayers not about martyrdom, but about community. About land. About staying alive, not dying for shadows. This is the unseen front in the war against terrorism. And yet, Egypt's role is not just martial, it is infrastructural. While bombs fall in the east, Cairo builds in the west. Proposals for roads connecting border posts. Bridges for food convoys. Airports to link security zones. Egypt isn't just training fighters. It's building arteries so the Sahel can breathe again. This matters. Because for too long, development came with strings. European grants. IMF loans. Aid with lectures. AES said no. And Egypt? Egypt said, we understand. But nothing in diplomacy is pure. Let's talk realpolitik. Egypt has its eyes on UNESCO. In 2025, its candidate Khaled El-Anani runs for Director General. 3 AES states hold votes. Alone, minor. Together, critical. Cairo's charm offensive is not just brotherhood, it is calculation. Yet even in that, there is respect. Because Cairo is not asking for submission. It is engaging with peers. It is, for once, treating Sahelian nations not as clients, but as partners. And that is why the alliance matters. It sets a precedent for how Africa can do business with itself. Without French supervision. Without American approval. Just Africans. With Africans. For Africans. That's not sentiment. That's a blueprint. And it is scaring the old architects. In Washington, the Africa desk frowns. In Brussels, eyebrows raise. Why is Egypt, our ally, talking to military juntas? Why is Sisi shaking hands with Traore, Goïta, Tiani? Because Egypt sees what they refuse to. These are not rogue states. They are frontline states. And their success or failure will shape the continent. From Cairo's perspective, backing AES is not a gamble. It's an investment in African-made security architecture. The West offered drone strikes. AES asked for dignity. The West sent warnings. Egypt sent blueprints. The West froze talks. AES built roads. This is the new language of power in Africa, action over applause. And now, others are listening. Tunisia. Algeria. Even Ethiopia. There is a quiet question forming across the continent: if Egypt can stand with AES, why can't we? This is not just about military exercises. It's about alignment. And Africa is aligning inward. Let that sink in. For the first time in post-colonial history, African states are forming security pacts without foreign commanders. Planning economy without French francs. Training imams without Gulf influence. And Egypt's role. It is the first northern anchor in the southern-led order. The Nile has turned its gaze southward. And the Sahel has opened its arms north. This is not normal diplomacy. This is tectonic shift. If you believe this alliance is more than headlines, if you see in it the promise of an Africa that governs, builds, and defends itself, then this is your moment. Some alliances are made in treaties. Others are forged in trenches. The Egypt-AES pact did not begin in a ballroom. It began in the realization that Africa's borders are illusions when terror moves like wind. It began when a Malian officer, barely 26, found a landmine near a school, and disarmed it using techniques borrowed from Sinai. It began when a Burkinabe imam stood up in a Friday sermon and told young men that the true jihad is rebuilding, not destroying. This is where diplomacy ends and doctrine begins. You see, Egypt did not come south with pity. It came with a plan. A strategic, multidimensional blueprint that doesn't just aim to support, but to synchronize. 3 pillars. Military. Ideological. Infrastructural. Each reinforcing the other. In military terms, Cairo isn't just offering training, it's redesigning theaters of operation. The Sahel, once a graveyard of failed interventions, is becoming a lab of resistance science. Through joint exercises, Egypt is mapping new doctrines for counterinsurgency, adapted to savannas, deserts, borderlands. Tactics built for African realities, not imported manuals. Imagine Egyptian and Nigerian officers co-planning border outpost layouts with satellite support. Picture AES commanders using Egyptian doctrine to secure mining corridors, not just for profit, but for protection. This is military sovereignty, taught by someone who's lived it. And yet, it's not just rifles that matter. In every war, there is a war of words. Al-Azha's influence stretches deeper than foreign embassies dare to look. Its graduates are not just imams. They are ideological counterweights. They teach Islam as a force of civilization, not a tool of coercion. Why does this matter? Because across the Sahel, extremist networks don't just use weapons. They use scripture. They weaponize shame. They prey on poverty. And for too long, the counter-narrative came in Western-accented NGO brochures: alien, distant, ineffective. Now, the counter-narrative is homegrown. African. Rooted in Cairo's thousand-year-old intellectual capital. And more importantly, spoken in Bambara, Hausa, Fulani. This is theological warfare. And AES just found its oldest ally. But no war, however sacred, is one without roads. Infrastructure. That is where Egypt makes its deepest bet. Let's talk numbers. 3 proposed regional airports. 9 joint infrastructure projects. 4 memorandums on agricultural logistics. These aren't announcements, they're blueprints in motion. And they aren't being built for show. They're being built for survival. Take the corridor from Niamey to Gao. Previously, a lifeline for arms smugglers and jihadist cells. Now, with Egyptian engineering, it's becoming a surveillance route. Equipped with embedded drone hubs and rapid deployment outposts. Or the bridge in East Burkina, designed by Cairo's Corps of Engineers, not just to carry vehicles, but to resist sabotage. To reroute convoys when attacks occur. This isn't charity. It's strategic redundancy. And the West knows it. When French advisors left, they said chaos would fill the vacuum. Instead, engineers showed up. When US policy makers issued warnings, Cairo issued steel. This is the quiet revolution no one headlines. Because the headline would read, Africa is building. Without permission. But Cairo's motives are not entirely selfless. Egypt's Suez Corridor is a geopolitical jugular. And instability in the Sahel threatens to send shockwaves into the Red Sea. The Horn of Africa, even up to the Levant. Cairo knows that a fragmented Sahel means a vulnerable Egypt. So it invests. Not in firewalls. But in fireproofing. That's realpolitik. But it's also realism. And here's the twist no one expected. By standing with AES, Egypt has unlocked soft power that decades of pro-West diplomacy failed to yield. It is now seen across Francophone Africa not as a distant northern cousin, but as kin. In Niamey, children draw pyramids next to AES flags. In Bamako, radio hosts refer to the Egyptian brothers from the desert. In Ouaga, local vendors sell handmade bracelets bearing the combined colors of the two alliances. This is not propaganda. This is presence. Presence that cannot be sanctioned. Influence that doesn't need a military base. It's the return of Pan-African gravity, centered not in Addis Ababa. Not in New York, but in the space between the Nile and the Niger. But every alliance reaches a test. And Egypt knows the next battle won't be about territory, but about influence. Will its educational support outlast the money from the Gulf? Will its engineers outbuild the development banks? Will Cairo's respect for sovereignty hold if AES transitions to democratic civilian rule? Because let's be honest, Cairo is not a democracy. Its human rights record is far from clean. But in this moment, where Western partners punish and isolate AES, Egypt chose engagement. That choice matters. Because in geopolitics, engagement is everything. And so, the question remains, is this the beginning of an African-led, African-built, African-defended century? Or just another chapter in a continent's long seduction? What makes this different is not Egypt's strength, but AES's clarity. AES didn't wait for Europe. It didn't ask for legitimacy. It acted. And Egypt responded, not with hesitation, but with handshake. That handshake, captured in a dusty courtyard in Ouagadougou, may one day be studied like the Camp David Accords or Bandung Conference. Not because of its glamour, but because of what it defied. It defied the script. In that script, Africa is a client. A battlefield. A cause. But here, in this chapter, Africa is a contractor. A builder. A partner. And Cairo, yes, Cairo, has joined the crew. Power in Africa is shifting, not westward, not eastward, but inward. For years, Africa's security architecture was drawn by others. France built bases. The US dropped drones. China signed contracts. And Africa managed expectations. But something broke. Not in silence, but in explosion. The withdrawal of Western forces from the Sahel left a vacuum. But the region did not collapse, it recalibrated. Mali said no. Burkina refused orders. Niger chose its own officers. And together, under the AES banner, they began doing what Africa was never supposed to do alone: defend itself. Then came Egypt. What followed was not a press conference, but a recalibration of gravity. For the first time, a North African heavyweight aligned itself, not with Western coalitions. Not with Arab spheres, but with the black heart of the continent. And suddenly, the world's compass spun. Because if Egypt, owner of one of Africa's most powerful armies, and the Suez gatekeeper, chooses to cooperate with AES, then everything changes. Borders become bridges. Margins become front lines. And the myth of African dependence begins to unravel. This is not just about fighting terrorism. It's about rewriting protocols. Under Cairo's influence, AES commanders are now building regional doctrines, rules of engagement based on African law, African terrain, African norms. That may sound small. But it is seismic. Because for decades, African armies were trained on foreign assumptions, that villagers are liabilities, that terrain is disposable, that logistics must rely on foreign airstrips. Now, the AES-Egypt coalition is rewriting that script. Villagers are informants, not enemies. Terrain is sacred. Logistics are local. These are more than tactics, they are declarations. Declarations that African wars will no longer be outsourced or misunderstood. But power does not exist in silos. As military ties deepen, so does economic integration. In Bamako, Egyptian contractors are now bidding alongside Burkinabe firms on solar irrigation. In Niamey, a grain storage project, co-designed by Egyptian engineers and Nigerian agriculturalists, is replacing outdated French silos. These are not gifts. These are deals. And deals reshape diplomacy. AES no longer knocks on Brussels' door. It opens doors in Cairo, Addis, Pretoria. This is the new continental web, one built not on former colonial ties, but on shared security interests and sovereign ambition. And Egypt. Egypt is not trying to lead. It is learning to listen. In a recent forum, the Egyptian delegation sat not at the head of the table, but side by side with AES ministers. No bodyguards towering. No translators whispering orders. Just conversation. It was subtle, but revolutionary. Because posture is politics. And in that moment, the politics said, "We are equals." That scares the old order. In the corridors of ECOWAS, whispers grow louder. Is Egypt enabling military regimes? Is this a betrayal of democratic norms? But who wrote those norms? Who enforced them selectively? The people of Sahel do not crave imported democracy. They crave safety, dignity, ownership. And Egypt's partnership offers something the West never quite delivered: tools without strings, cooperation without lectures. Still, critics persist. They say Egypt wants influence. That it is positioning for Red Sea trade leverage. That it is exploiting AES isolation for advantage. Perhaps. But if influence is earned through support, not coercion, is that not the better kind? Because what is emerging now is a model, call it the Ouagadougou framework. A new way of inter-African cooperation. Where security support comes with training. Not trainers. Where investment comes with dignity, not directives. Where diplomacy comes with listening, not leverage. And at the center of it, ironically, is Egypt. The very country once accused of turning its back on sub-Saharan Africa. Now leading the bridge-building effort. Not with headlines. But with hospitals. With airfields. With trained minds. And the signal is spreading. Ghana is reassessing its defense protocols. Togo is studying AES logistics. Even the DRC, long stuck in its own storms, is watching. The continent is stirring. Not because Egypt is leading. But because AES is holding firm. Because AES showed that refusal is a form of leadership. That standing alone can attract those ready to stand together. The message is simple. You don't need Paris to be legitimate. You don't need Washington to build. You don't need aid to rise. And Egypt, a nation once addicted to Western aid, now echoes that message. It is not a perfect ally. But it is present. It is practical. It is Pan-African. And that presence is worth more than 10 donor conferences. Because in the end, what Africa needs is not sympathy, it's sovereignty. And sovereignty is not given. It is claimed. AES claimed it. Egypt recognized it. And the rest of the continent is waking up to it. Every alliance casts a shadow. For all its promise, the Egypt-AES partnership is not without peril. Because somewhere between support and strategy lies the question of control. Today, the world applauds Egypt's alignment with the Sahel. But behind closed doors, diplomats whisper. Is Cairo really empowering AES? Or subtly embedding itself into the new command center of Africa? Power rarely moves without motive. And Egypt, veteran of Cold War games, Arab diplomacy, and Nile politics, never plays blind. Its military trainers are welcomed. But what of the advisors that follow? Its engineers build bridges. But who decides where they lead? Its imams preach peace. But whose version of peace? Al-Azhar may be countering jihadist extremism. But is it also reshaping spiritual authority in the Sahel, replacing one center with another? The very success of this partnership may plant seeds of dependence dressed as autonomy. And then there is the question of time. What happens when Cairo's candidate at UNESCO is elected? Will the same urgency remain? Will the investments continue once diplomatic goals are secured? History warns us, when great powers achieve their aims, the phone calls slow down. The convoys stop. The handshakes vanish. AES was built on defiance. On saying no to ECOWAS. To France, to IMF conditionalities. Can it now say no to Cairo if interests diverge? This is not cynicism. It is clarity. Real sovereignty means being able to thank a partner, and still walk a separate path. The danger is not that Egypt dominates. It is that the world mistakes coordination for conquest. That Pan-Africanism becomes North Africanism with a Southern accent. But here is the difference. AES is not naive. Captain Traore, Colonel Goita, General Tiani, they've read the manuals. They've seen how friendly fire becomes policy. They've seen how aid turns into expectation. And that is why the alliance works, for now. Because respect, like revolution, is delicate. It grows when both sides resist temptation, the temptation to manipulate, the temptation to submit. Cairo has much to offer. But the future will depend not on its strength, but on its restraint. Will it remain a builder, or try to become a foreman? That question will define the next chapter. Because no matter how many roads are paved or how many mosques are restored, sovereignty cannot be subcontracted. And Africa's awakening will not be written in Cairo. It will be written where it began, in the dust of Niamey. In the courtyards of Bamako, in the firewalked streets of Ouagadougou. AES rose not because it was helped, but because it refused to fall. Egypt has joined the march. But the drumbeat belongs to the Sahel. This is more than a pact. It is a promise. That Africa will no longer rise through permission slips. That its future will not be subcontracted through empty summits. That power, real, grounded, sovereign power, comes not from proximity to the West, but from unity within. AES did not wait for peacekeepers. It became its own. Egypt did not dictate terms. It listened. And in listening, it reclaimed its place, not above, but beside. Now the question turns to us. Will we remain observers? Or will we add our voices to the drumbeat of sovereignty? Because history isn't written by those who wait. It is shaped by those who walk, even barefoot, into fire. If this vision of Africa stirs something in you, like, comment, and subscribe. Say it with your voice. Share it with your community. Let the world know the continent is no longer quiet. It is marching. It is building. And it will never bow again.